Amara was a little girl who had already seen more hardship than most people ever would. She lived with her grandmother in a tiny room at the edge of the city. The building was old and broken in many places, with paint peeling off the walls and the smell of dampness everywhere. Still, to Amara, it was home. Every morning, she woke up with the sound of cars honking far away, and every night, she fell asleep listening to the voices of people arguing, laughing, or singing on the street outside. Life was not easy, but she had learned to live with less. On this particular afternoon, her stomach growled louder than usual. She hadn't eaten a proper meal since the day before, and even then, it was just a small bowl of rice her grandmother had managed to stretch with water and salt. Her grandmother was old, her hands trembling whenever she tried to cook or sew, and it was Amara who often ran errands and searched for food. Despite her age, she was quick and clever. She could spot small chances where others might see nothing. As Amara wandered along the busy sidewalk, her eyes caught the bright windows of a restaurant she had never entered. The smell of roasted meat, butter, and warm bread floated into the air, making her mouth water. She stopped outside the glass door, watching people inside laugh as they ate full plates of food. Waiters moved quickly from table to table, carrying dishes that looked like feasts. Amara pressed her hand against her stomach. She wasn't used to luxury, but hunger made her bold. She noticed a man sitting alone near the window. He was dressed in a suit, though he sat in a wheelchair. His face carried a stern expression, as if he was lost in thought. The table in front of him was filled with dishes: steak, vegetables, bread, even a slice of cake that he had barely touched. Amara stared at the food, then at the man. Something inside her whispered that she should not beg like everyone else on the street. She wanted to ask in a way that gave her dignity. When the man finally finished his meal and signaled the waiter, Amara quickly stepped closer to the door. She saw him push his plate away, leaving most of the food untouched. The waiter packed up what remained, placing it neatly in a paper bag. That was when Amara's heart started to beat faster. She had made up her mind. As the man wheeled himself toward the exit, Amara moved in front of the door. She was small, so he almost didn't notice her until she lifted her chin and spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her eyes shining with both fear and determination. "If you don't want your leftovers, could I have them? I can give you something in return, a miracle." The man blinked at her, surprised. He had been used to people asking for money, sometimes pulling at his sleeves or begging in desperate voices. But this little girl did not beg. She stood with her shoulders back, her dark eyes fixed on him as if she truly believed she had something to offer. He looked down at her bare feet, her worn dress, and then back at her hopeful face. A laugh slipped from his lips, low at first and then louder. "A miracle," he said, shaking his head. "Child, what kind of miracle could you give me?" His voice carried both disbelief and amusement. He was a man who had once owned companies, built towers, and traveled across oceans. Now, after an accident, he spent his life in a wheelchair. Doctors had told him he would never walk again. To him, miracles were just fairy tales people used to comfort themselves. But Amara didn't move. She clasped her hands together and nodded earnestly. "Yes, sir. My grandmother always says even small hands can bring big hope. If you share your food with me, I promise I'll give you something to make your heart lighter. That is my miracle." The man studied her for a long moment. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him with such certainty. Most people pitied him, avoided him, or treated him as if he were made of glass. But this girl, this little stranger, looked at him as if he was still important, still capable of feeling joy. Something inside him stirred, a feeling he had not allowed himself to feel for years. Yet, pride made him hide it. He smirked and said, "You're a brave little one. But I warn you, I don't believe in miracles anymore." Amara tilted her head. That's okay, she replied simply. I believe enough for both of us. The words hung in the air, delicate yet strong. For a brief second, the man's laughter faded. He felt something shift deep inside him, though he could not name it. Slowly, he handed her the paper bag. It felt like such a small thing to him, leftovers he would have thrown away. But to her, it was treasure. Amara's face lit up as if he had given her gold. She held the bag close and whispered, "Thank you, sir. Tomorrow I'll come back and show you my miracle." Then she skipped away, her steps light despite her hunger, disappearing into the crowd. The man sat there for a moment, watching her go. He told himself it was nothing, just another hungry child he had fed by chance. Yet the words she left behind echoed in his mind. Tomorrow I'll come back and show you my miracle. He wheeled himself toward his car, still half smiling, half confused. He didn't know why he had given her the food. He didn't know why her words lingered longer than the taste of his expensive meal. All he knew was that something in him, something long asleep, had stirred awake. That night, as he lay in his wide empty bed in his grand house, he found himself wondering not about his businesses, not about the people who had left him after his accident, not about the life he had lost, but about the small barefoot girl who believed in miracles. And for the first time in many years, instead of closing his eyes with bitterness, he fell asleep with a faint smile. The next afternoon, the streets were crowded again, filled with the noise of buses, motorbikes, and people rushing home from work. The sun was lower in the sky, painting the buildings in warm orange light. Amara held her grandmother's scarf tightly around her shoulders, though the scarf was old and torn in places. She was excited, her little heart racing with the memory of her promise. She had told the rich man in the wheelchair that she would bring him a miracle, and she was determined not to break her word. She arrived at the same restaurant where she had first seen him. She waited by the door, her eyes moving through the crowd until she spotted him again. There he was, Richard, wearing another fine suit, sitting in his wheelchair near the same window, eating silently. His face was stern, almost tired, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Amara pressed her hands together nervously. She wondered if he would remember her. Maybe he had already forgotten. Maybe he had laughed at her words and decided not to care. But a promise was a promise, and she was not the kind of girl who gave up easily. When Richard finished his meal and rolled toward the door, Amara stepped forward, just as she had the day before. She smiled brightly. "Hello, sir," she said cheerfully. "I came back, just like I promised." Richard stopped, surprised. He had not expected her to return. He had told himself that the girl's boldness was just a moment of childish bravery, something fleeting. But here she was again, her eyes shining with the same determination. He raised an eyebrow. "You," he said, recognizing her. "You really came back?" "Yes," Amara nodded. "I told you I would. Yesterday you gave me food. Today I will give you my miracle." Richard let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Child, you're still talking about miracles? I told you, I don't believe in them. The world doesn't work that way." His voice was not unkind, but there was an edge of bitterness. Amara did not flinch. Instead, she walked closer until she was right in front of him. She placed her tiny hands behind her back and rocked on her heels like she was thinking carefully. "Maybe you don't believe because you forgot what it feels like," she said softly. "But I haven't forgotten. I still believe." Her words were simple, yet they pierced him more than he wanted to admit. Richard's laugh grew louder, partly because he was amused and partly because he was uncomfortable. "You think a little girl like you can bring a miracle to a man like me?" He gestured to his legs, his voice rising slightly. "Look at me. I can't walk. I can't run. The life I used to have, it's gone. Do you really think you can change that?" People passing by glanced at the strange scene, a little girl speaking bravely to a wealthy man in a wheelchair. But Amara did not care. She tilted her head, studying him with her wide, innocent eyes. Then she smiled again, gentle but firm. "Maybe I can't make you walk," she admitted. "But not all miracles are about walking. Some miracles are about smiling. Some are about remembering that life still has good things." For a moment, Richard had no reply. Her words caught him off guard. He had expected begging, maybe tears or desperation, but instead, she spoke with wisdom far beyond her years. He laughed again, but this time it was softer, less mocking. "You're a strange little one," he muttered. Amara clapped her hands once, as if she had won a small victory. "Then let me prove it," she said brightly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was creased and worn, but she opened it carefully and handed it to him. "This is my first miracle," she declared. Richard took the paper curiously. On it was a drawing, rough and simple, made with pencil and crayon. It showed a man in a wheelchair with a big smile on his face, surrounded by children who were laughing. Above the drawing were the words, "You are still important." Richard stared at it for a long time. He felt something in his chest shift again, something he didn't want to admit. He cleared his throat and said, "You drew this?" "Yes," Amara nodded proudly. "I made it last night. My grandmother gave me an old crayon, and I stayed up until the candle burned out. This is my miracle for you. Because even if you think life is finished, you are still important. You still matter." The restaurant door swung open behind him, and the waiter appeared with his leftover bag again. Richard took it absent-mindedly, his eyes still fixed on the paper in his hand. For years, he had been surrounded by expensive things: cars, houses, clothes. Yet here he was, holding a child's drawing, and it felt more valuable than any of them. Amara beamed when she saw him staring at it. "See? I told you I'd bring a miracle." You smiled a little. "That means it worked." Richard realized she was right. He had smiled, even if only for a moment. It had been so long since a real smile had crossed his face that he had almost forgotten how it felt. He quickly covered it with another laugh, but deep inside, he felt the truth. "You're clever," he said at last, folding the paper carefully and slipping it into his pocket. "But don't think you can fool me with just a drawing. Miracles are bigger than that." Amara nodded confidently. "Then I'll come again tomorrow. Every day, I'll bring you another miracle. You'll see. Miracles don't have to be big all at once. Sometimes they come little by little." Richard sighed, shaking his head again, though this time with less resistance. "You're impossible," he said. "Most children would have taken the food and run. But you keep coming back." "Because I promised," Amara replied simply. "And because you need me." Those last words startled him. "You need me?" No one had spoken to him like that in years. People pitied him, yes, but no one ever suggested he needed them. He had always been the one others needed, the man with money and power. Now this tiny girl dared to suggest the opposite. And strangely, he did not hate it. As Richard wheeled himself toward his car, Amara waved after him. "Don't forget. Tomorrow I'll be here again with a new miracle," she called. He waved back absent-mindedly, trying to shake off the strange warmth in his chest. He told himself he wouldn't come back tomorrow, that he had no reason to entertain a child's games. But later that night, when he emptied his pockets, the folded drawing slipped out. He opened it again under the soft light of his lamp, staring at the smiling face she had sketched for him. And for the second night in a row, he went to bed with something unusual lingering inside him: not bitterness, not loneliness, but the faint echo of hope. The following day, the city moved with its usual rush. Cars honked impatiently, bicycles weaved between buses, and vendors called out their prices along the sidewalks. In the middle of the noise, Amara hurried down the street with a small bag clutched in her hands. Inside the bag was something very simple, yet to her, it was precious. She had stayed awake the night before, thinking about what miracle she could bring next. She wanted it to be different from the drawing. She wanted it to make the man in the wheelchair believe, even just a little more. When she arrived near the restaurant, she saw him again. Richard was already there, dressed in another clean suit, his hair neatly combed back. He was not eating yet. He sat quietly, staring out of the large glass window, his face unreadable. Amara hesitated for a moment, wondering if he was in a bad mood. Then she remembered her promise. Promises were not made to be broken. She skipped forward with her usual bright smile and stood near the door, waiting until he noticed her. Richard's eyes shifted, and when he saw her, his lips twitched into something halfway between a smile and a sigh. "You again," he said as she walked up to him. "Yes, me again," Amara answered cheerfully. "I told you I would come back every day. Today I brought another miracle." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Another one? Child, aren't you tired of this game?" "It's not a game," she replied firmly. "It's a promise. Yesterday I gave you a drawing. Today I'll give you something else." She carefully opened the bag in her hands and pulled out a small flower. It wasn't perfect, the petals were slightly bruised, and its stem was short, but it was bright yellow, the kind of flower that could make even a dull street corner look alive. Richard looked at it, puzzled. "A flower?" he asked slowly. "Yes," Amara nodded. "I found it growing near the road. Everyone walked past it, but I saw it. I picked it for you because my grandmother says flowers remind us that even in broken places, life finds a way to bloom." She held it out to him with both hands. "This is my miracle today. To remind you that life can still grow even if things feel broken." For a long moment, Richard did not move. He stared at the flower, then at the small hands offering it to him. Something about her words pressed against his heart. He reached out and took it gently, holding it as if it were more fragile than glass. "You're strange," he said finally, though his voice had softened. "Most people would laugh at the idea of giving a flower to a man like me." Amara shook her head. "That's because most people don't see miracles. But I do. And I think you can see them too if you try." Richard looked down at the flower again. The laugh that came this time wasn't bitter or mocking. It was quiet, almost shy, as though he hadn't heard himself laugh that way in years. He tucked the flower carefully into the pocket of his jacket. "All right, little one," he said. "You've given me 2 miracles now. But how long can you keep this up?" Amara's smile grew. "As long as I need to," she replied with complete confidence. "I promised I would give you reasons to smile every day. And I never break my promises." Richard shook his head, but there was a spark in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. He leaned back in his chair and studied her. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Why waste your time on a broken man?" Amara frowned slightly. "You're not broken. You're just sad. And sometimes people need someone to remind them that they're still important. My grandmother says when you help someone smile, it makes your own heart stronger too." She tilted her head. "Maybe I need you as much as you need me." Those words struck him deeply. He looked away, pretending to watch the people on the street, but in truth he was hiding the way his chest ached at her honesty. For so long, he had believed that he was useless, unwanted, and left behind by the world. Yet this little girl, who had so little herself, insisted on giving him hope. "Do you even have enough food to eat at home?" he asked suddenly, his voice softer than before. Amara shrugged. "Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But it's okay. We always find a way. Yesterday your food filled me and my grandmother. She said it was the best meal we've had in months. Richard blinked. He had thrown away leftovers without a second thought for years, never realizing how much they could mean to someone else. The idea that his discarded food had been called the best meal by anyone shook him. He gripped the armrest of his chair and asked quietly, "And yet, even though you don't have much, you spend your time worrying about me." "Yes," Amara answered simply. "Because miracles are not about what you have. They're about what you give." Richard felt his throat tighten. He cleared it quickly and tried to cover his feelings with another smile. "You're wiser than most adults I know," he admitted. "All right then, Amara. If you promise to keep bringing these miracles, I'll promise to keep listening." Her eyes widened, glowing with joy. "So you'll let me keep my promise?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. But only if you keep coming back." "Deal." "Deal," she said happily, clapping her hands. The waiter brought his leftover bag again, and Richard handed it to her without hesitation this time. Amara accepted it with gratitude, bowing slightly the way her grandmother had taught her. "Thank you, sir. I'll see you tomorrow," she said, her voice full of excitement. As she skipped away, Richard leaned back in his chair, holding the small yellow flower in his pocket. He found himself smiling again, and this time, it didn't feel forced. For years he had believed his life ended when he lost the use of his legs. But here was a little girl who treated him not with pity, but with belief. She didn't see a broken man, she saw someone worth giving miracles to. That night, when he returned to his house, he placed the flower in a small glass of water by his bedside. It looked simple, almost ordinary, but when he stared at it, he felt something shift inside him once more. He remembered her words, "Even in broken places, life finds a way to bloom." As he lay in bed, he realized that for the third night in a row, he wasn't falling asleep with bitterness or loneliness. Instead, he closed his eyes with the faint comfort of a promise, her promise that tomorrow, there would be another miracle waiting. Days turned into weeks, and Amara kept her promise. Every afternoon, just as the sun began to sink behind the tall buildings, she appeared at the same restaurant door. Sometimes she brought small gifts she made with her own hands, like a folded paper bird or a drawing of a sunrise. Sometimes she brought nothing but a story, a tale about her grandmother's childhood, or a funny thing she had seen on the street that morning. Other times she sang a little song in her sweet voice, her words carrying more joy than any tune he had ever heard on the radio. Richard began to expect her visits. At first, he told himself it was curiosity. He wanted to see if she would truly return every day as she had promised. But soon, he realized it was something more. He found himself waiting for her, watching the door, listening for her cheerful voice. His meals, which once felt like empty routines, became the moments he looked forward to because they meant Amara would appear with her next miracle. One afternoon, she told him about her dream. She said she wanted to become a teacher one day, to stand in front of children and teach them how to read and write. She explained that her grandmother had taught her the alphabet, but there were still many words she didn't know. "If I can learn more," she said, her eyes glowing with determination, "then I can teach other children like me. I want them to believe that they can be something more." Richard listened carefully. He could see how much the dream meant to her, and something inside him softened even more. He thought about his own life before the accident. He had been so busy building wealth, signing contracts, and chasing success that he had forgotten what it was like to dream as purely as this child did. For her, dreams were not about money or power. They were about hope and helping others. That evening, when he returned home, he could not stop thinking about her words. He remembered when he had once dreamed too before everything was taken from him. Her simple dream stirred memories of the man he used to be, the man who believed he could change the world. The changes in him did not go unnoticed. His house staff, who had grown used to his silence and coldness, noticed that he laughed more often now. His doctors, who had once worried about his health, began to see improvements. His shoulders were less tense, his eyes less tired. Even though his body was still weak, his spirit seemed to be waking up. It was as if Amara's visits were medicine, healing him in ways no doctor ever could. One day, as Amara sat by his table, she noticed the faint lines of a smile on his face. "You're smiling more now," she said happily. Richard chuckled softly. "Maybe that's because of your miracles," he admitted. She clapped her hands together. "See? I told you they would work." He shook his head in wonder. "I never thought a little girl with nothing could give me so much. I thought I had everything once: cars, houses, business deals. But I see now, I was missing the most important thing." Amara tilted her head curiously. "What's that?" "Hope," he said simply. Her face lit up with joy. "Then that means I kept my promise. I gave you a miracle." Richard stared at her for a long moment, feeling a deep gratitude he didn't know how to express. He wanted to tell her how much she had changed him, how she had given him something money could never buy. But he kept his words simple, because he knew she understood without him having to explain too much. As the weeks went on, the bond between them grew stronger. Richard began sharing stories from his own life. He told her about the places he had traveled to before the accident, the buildings he had built, and the successes he had achieved. Amara listened with wide eyes, fascinated. But more than his stories of wealth, she loved the times he spoke about his childhood, when he was a boy playing in the fields, climbing trees, and laughing with friends. She said those stories proved he was still the same person inside, not just the man in the wheelchair. Little by little, Richard started to believe it too. He no longer saw himself as just the man who could not walk. He began to see himself as someone who still had value, someone who still had a role in the world. Amara had given him that gift. One afternoon, after Amara shared another one of her cheerful stories, Richard looked at her and asked, "Amara, do you know what you've done to me?" She blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" "You've woken me up," he said quietly. "For years I've been alive, but not really living. I thought my life was over when I lost my legs. But you've shown me that I can still smile, still dream, still matter. That is the biggest miracle of all." Amara's eyes grew wide, and then she grinned. "Then you should promise me something now." He raised an eyebrow. "What promise?" "Promise me you'll keep smiling, even when I'm not here," she said firmly. "Promise me you'll remember that you're still important." Richard chuckled and held out his hand. "All right, little one. I promise." She shook his hand with all the seriousness in the world, as if they had just sealed the most important deal of his life. That night, Richard lay in bed staring at the flower Amara had given him weeks ago, now dried but still standing tall in its little glass. He thought about her smile, her words, her endless belief in miracles. And for the first time in years, he whispered a prayer of thanks, not for his wealth, not for his possessions, but for the gift of a child who had reminded him what it meant to be alive. The change inside him was real. And though his legs still could not move, his heart had begun to walk again, step by step, toward hope. Months passed, and the city's rhythm continued as always, with cars rushing down crowded streets, vendors shouting prices, and people hurrying to work. But for Richard, everything had changed. The days that once felt empty and heavy were now filled with meaning, because he knew that every afternoon Amara would appear with her bright smile and her small miracles. His doctors were astonished. They had seen his health improve in ways they hadn't expected. His breathing was steadier, his appetite had returned, and even his posture was stronger. They told him that although his paralysis remained, his overall well-being had grown so much better. Richard knew the truth: it was not medicine or treatment that had brought this change. It was Amara. One afternoon, as the golden light of sunset filled the restaurant, Amara arrived carrying something different. Instead of her usual drawing, flower, or story, she had a small notebook in her hands. She had tied it with a piece of string, and though it looked simple, her face glowed with excitement. "What do you have today?" Richard asked with curiosity. "This is my biggest miracle yet," she said proudly, handing it to him. Richard opened the notebook. Inside were pages filled with drawings, short poems, and little notes. Some were stories she had made up about magical places where everyone was happy. Others were words of encouragement she had copied from her grandmother's sayings. And on one page, in her neatest handwriting, she had written, "You gave me food, but I gave you hope. Now we both have more than we had before." Richard's throat tightened as he flipped through the pages. Every word, every sketch, was filled with so much innocence and love. "You made this, for me?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," Amara nodded. "Because you kept my promise too. You smiled. You laughed. You showed me that even someone who has lost something can still find joy. That is a miracle too." Richard sat quietly for a long moment, holding the notebook close to his chest. He felt tears in his eyes, something he had not allowed himself for years. "Amara," he said softly, "you've changed me more than you know. I thought my life ended with my accident. I thought I was only a shadow of who I used to be. But you showed me I was wrong." Amara leaned closer. "So now you believe in miracles?" she asked with a grin. Richard smiled, a warm and genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Yes," he admitted. "Because you are my miracle." Her laughter filled the air, light and joyful, and for Richard it was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. But he was not a man who could only take. He had always been someone who gave, someone who built, someone who created. And now that his heart was alive again, he wanted to give back to the little girl who had given him everything. That evening, as he wheeled himself back to his car, he made a decision. The next day, when Amara arrived as usual, she found Richard waiting outside the restaurant with a smile on his face. "Today," he said, "I have something for you." Her eyes widened. "For me?" "Yes," he nodded. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a letter with her name written neatly on it. Amara opened it carefully and tried to read, but some of the words were too big. Richard noticed and began to read it aloud for her. The letter explained that he had arranged for her to attend proper school, with books, teachers, and everything she would need to chase her dream of becoming a teacher one day. He had already paid for her education, uniforms, and supplies. "You said you wanted to teach others," he told her. "So I'm going to help you learn. That way, you can spread even more miracles to the world." Amara's eyes filled with tears of joy. She hugged the letter to her chest and whispered, "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." But Richard wasn't finished. He also told her that he had set up a small fund for her grandmother, so she would never have to worry about food again. "You gave me back my will to live," he said. "Now let me give you something in return. It's not just about money, it's about making sure your kindness grows into something bigger." Amara covered her mouth with her hands, overwhelmed. "So this is your miracle for me?" "Yes," Richard smiled. "It's my turn now." From that day on, their bond only grew stronger. Amara began attending school, and every afternoon, after her classes, she would still stop by to see Richard. She would tell him about what she had learned, show him new words she could write, or share the stories her teachers told. And Richard listened with pride, knowing that he had played a part in her future. People in the neighborhood began to notice the unusual friendship between the rich man in the wheelchair and the poor girl with bright eyes. At first, they whispered and wondered, but soon, they began to smile whenever they saw the two together. There was something beautiful about the way they laughed, about the way they supported one another. For Richard, the greatest miracle was not walking again, it was realizing that life still had purpose. And for Amara, the greatest miracle was not the food she received, but the chance to learn, to grow, and to keep her grandmother safe. One evening, as the sun set in a sky painted with shades of pink and gold, Richard looked at Amara and said, "Do you remember the first day we met? You asked me for leftovers and promised me a miracle." "Yes," she said, giggling. "And you laughed at me." He chuckled. "I did. But I'm not laughing now. Because you were right. You gave me more than I ever expected." Amaro leaned against his wheelchair and smiled. "And you gave me more than I ever dreamed." They sat together quietly, watching the people pass by, the city alive with its endless rhythm. For them, life was no longer about what they had lost or what they lacked. It was about what they had found in each other: hope, friendship, and the kind of love that could not be measured by wealth or by circumstances. And so, the poor girl who once asked for leftovers and the paralyzed millionaire who thought his life was over proved something extraordinary, that miracles are real. They may not always come as sudden wonders or grand events. Sometimes they come as small acts of kindness, as promises kept, as laughter shared between two unlikely friends. Richard and Amara remained in each other's lives, and though the world continued to rush by, they carried their quiet miracle with them every day. It was a miracle not of healed legs, but of healed hearts. A miracle that turned loneliness into friendship, despair into hope, and hunger into a future full of possibility. And that was enough to change everything.